Ladies and gentlemen, I'm proud to introduce John Samuelsen.
It's certainly an important event here today to drive home the message in Albany about the importance of public transit funding. It's important for riders, organized labor, and employers to come together to drive home that point. So we're in Albany. Right now, at this very second, as Chairman Lhota alluded to, in Washington, D.C., there are decision makers that are actually attacking public transit funding. Attacking public transit funding. Now, when you attack public transit funding, you attack working families. Now, the bill that's being proposed in Congress is an anti-urban bill that will have a devastating effect on working people across the United States of America, not only in New York. On Wednesday, TW Local 100 and members of the MTA Labor Coalition of unions are heading down to DC to take this show on the road, this message of the importance of public transit funding. We're going to Congress. We invite everybody in the audience right here to join us on that trip. It is needed. It is needed for the folks in Congress that may not understand the importance of urban public transit systems, to hear it from the folks that ride, to hear it from the folks that work the systems, and to hear it from the folks that run the systems. Now, the opening speaker spoke about mass transit, public transit being an economic engine in New York State. And of course, that's absolutely true. But we hear it time and time again. Time and time again. Almost every speaker who speaks about public transit funding invokes the message that the economic engine and the economic benefits of public transit funding on a state's economy are unparalleled. Well, you know what? It's time for folks, it's time for decision makers in Albany and decision makers in Washington, D.C. to put their money where their mouth is and start taking seriously public transit funding. Now, I'm also pleased that this year, Governor Cuomo, for the first time in several years, has taken all the earmarked transit funding dollars that the MTA is entitled to and given it over to us. But you know what? That's not good enough. We need to end permanently the annual uncertainty that New York City Transit riders go through and New York City Transit workers go through as to whether or not state government is going to properly allocate funds that are already pre-dedicated to the MTA in New York City. We need to end the up and down, the anxiety that this causes every time that we adopt a budget. So we call on Governor Cuomo to make it permanent, to sign the lockbox law amendments that was spoken about by Assemblyman Brennan and Senator Golden. We need to end this once and for all and properly fund mass transit in New York State. And I think one thing I meant to say earlier on is there's a whole lot that we're going to disagree with, particularly with the MTA, and there's a whole lot that I disagree with Chairman Lhota right now, and you know, much of that could be read about in the newspapers as we go forward through this contract negotiation. But the one thing that we certainly agree on is the necessity for a properly funded mass transit, public transit system in New York City and throughout the region. And I think I would be remiss not to close with this remark. Deputy Secretary for Labor Karen Ray mentioned early on about the importance of spending the money that we have in the right way and finding the most sensible way to spend the dollars that are allocated toward public transit in New York City. Now, TW Local 100 is actually doing that right now with the MTA. We're working on initiatives that will produce a more economical spending of the dollars that we do have. But a word to Karen Ray and a word to Chairman Lhota and a word to Governor Cuomo, that the sensible spending of the money and a discussion about how to best spend our dollars in the most productive fashion can never, ever boil down to a discussion about workers bearing the burden of a so-called discussion about how to most economically spend our money, or transit riders bearing that burden either. Thank you.